much, Michael, and thanks to Sarah for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for coming today. What Michael has done, I think, very eloquently has laid out the general context that we face now that Rouhani has been sworn in as president of Iran, and covered, I think, the broad picture in his background. I agree with everything he said. I want to focus just on one aspect that I think is critical for the United States and Israel and our friends in the region and worldwide, and that's the Iranian nuclear weapons program. Because we're about to embark almost any day on another round of the almost endless negotiations to resolve, quote-unquote, the Iranian nuclear weapons program. And in the election of Rouhani, we have as close, I think, to a scientific experiment as you can get in international affairs about what to expect. It's not simply speculating from his resume over time. It's looking at what he actually did during the period 2003 to 2005 when he served as Iran's chief nuclear negotiator. And he comes in at a point where Iran has some very specific objectives on the nuclear front. Number one, continuing and expanding their program, and number two, getting relief from the economic sanctions. I don't believe that the sanctions have had any impact on the nuclear weapons program. I think they have had an economic effect on Iran, largely detrimental to many of the elements of the Iranian population most opposed to the regime, and careful targeting of sanctions that undercuts the people who ought to be most active against the regime. But the fact is, as the war in Syria shows, Iran has sufficient resources to continue despite the sanctions. So that's why Rouhani could not be a better public face given his background. And I want to talk about that background because although I never had the pleasure of meeting with him personally, since we weren't negotiating back in the bad old days with Iran, but I talked endlessly to the Europeans who did negotiate with him. And, you know, it's sometimes fair to say you can't blame a negotiator for the positions he's espousing or the tactics he employs or the routes that he follows, except in the case of Rouhani. We know that after he left the job as nuclear negotiator, he talked about it, he wrote about it publicly, and boasted about what he had accomplished. So this record of activity is not simply what he was instructed to do from higher-ups in Iran. It's what he actively wanted to do, what I think he helped persuade the government that he served to follow, and I think do give us a roadmap for what's about to happen. And I think, unfortunately, it also gives us a roadmap about what's to happen with the Europeans. So let me just review this period, 2003-2005, very briefly, because I think if we understand what happened then, we will understand what's about to happen and hopefully find ways here in this country to try and prevent the United States and the Europeans from making concessions that will simply guarantee that Iran reaches its goal of nuclear weapons sooner rather than later. The whole concept of negotiating with Iran over the nuclear program beginning in 2003 started with the Europeans, started with Britain, France, and Germany. And I believe that there's no doubt that they saw a negotiated solution. Leave aside for a minute what that is. I mean, I know that's a small point, but just leave aside what it is. They saw a negotiated solution as showing up the United States. You know, the cowboys in the United States see a threat in the likes of Saddam Hussein and his programs and weapons of mass destruction, and what do? You get a war, you get a coalition provisional authority, you get endless trouble down the road. Whereas we suave and sophisticated Europeans will show we'll negotiate with Iran, we'll show there's a better alternative, and we will solve the nuclear problem of Iran much better than the Americans botched the problem in Iraq. There are a lot of reasons to demonstrate this. Remember, France and Germany knifed us in the run-up to the war against Saddam Hussein. We counted on their support. They were actively working with the Russians against us in the Security Council and elsewhere. Why was Britain involved? Because Jack Straw was foreign minister. The biggest issue for Britain in international affairs then was Iraq. Tony Blair handled that. Straw had nothing to do, so he thought he'd team up with the French and the Germans to do Iran. And the view of the Europeans was, if we can get Iran to suspend its enrichment program, we can freeze their progress toward nuclear weapons and thus give us time to negotiate a macro solution. So they began the pursuit of this endless round of trying to get a suspension of the uranium enrichment program that would then be the predicate for the conclusive negotiations. And you can see over a 10-year period, this has never changed. They're still pursuing the same elusive goal. In the period 2003 to 2005, the Iranian nuclear weapons program ran into substantial technical difficulties, not just in enrichment, but in the stage prior to that, uranium conversion, which is the chemical transformation of uranium from a solid into a gas, so that from uranium oxide, U3O8, into uranium hexafluoride. It's the UF6 that's actually run through the centrifuges. If you can't get the uranium from solid form into gas form, you can't do enrichment. So that the suspension that was negotiated and was kind of off and on over the entire period Rouhani was the negotiator had nothing to do with Iranian good faith efforts to find a way to get the more permanent negotiations in place. They were suspended as a technical matter anyway. They were having trouble on uranium conversion, they were having trouble with their centrifuges, and they were not making much progress. Moreover, during that same period, they were, as I think we all know now, scared to death that the United States and its allies had 400,000 military personnel in Iraq, had overthrown Saddam Hussein, and were in effect right on their border, just a couple of years after having overthrown the Taliban in Afghanistan on their other border. So they were very worried. And Rouhani and others were able to take the technical difficulties that they found, their strategic fear of the United States, and the eagerness of the Europeans to prove that they had a superior way to deal with nuclear proliferation and do something that would-be proliferators need in the worst possible way. They need time and they need legitimacy. They need legitimacy so that they're not put under real pressure. And they need time to overcome the scientific and technological complexities that stand in the way of getting a deliverable nuclear weapons capability, which is an enormous undertaking for any country. Rouhani was able to use the Europeans to persuade them again and again that he was operating in good faith when he knew that his commitment to suspend didn't do anything other than reflect the reality that already existed at the Iranian uranium conversion facility and their enrichment facility. They weren't working anyway, so why not say you were making a political decision to suspend when you didn't really have any technological alternative? And the result of that was that Iran got exactly what it needed. It got cover, it got political legitimacy, it gained time. And when the technological difficulties were overcome, amazingly, Iran stopped its suspension of its enrichment program. What a coincidence. This is not something that we glean simply from the information that we gather. This is the thrust of what Rouhani said in his post-negotiator writings and speeches, that they persuaded the Europeans. He used the most derisive and sarcastic rhetoric to describe the European negotiators about how they basically fell for the line that he was peddling. And of course it was not published in English until many years after he gave the speeches and wrote the articles. And so the Europeans who were actually engaged in the activity across the table from Rouhani didn't have time to react or didn't have the opportunity to react in public. I'm not sure they could feel shame anyway, but he certainly made it clear how he had outclassed them as a negotiator. So coming forward to today, it is clear beyond dispute that the Europeans are getting ready to be suckered yet again. That they are desperate now, knowing how much closer Iran is to a nuclear weapons capability, knowing of the very broad and deep nuclear infrastructure that Iran has built. They've got a nuclear reactor, a commercial scope reactor in operation with some difficulty at Bushehr. That's the first commercial scale nuclear reactor that Israel has permitted to be put into operation in a hostile state. I think that was a mistake on Israel's part, but in any event, Bushehr is up and running. They've got very extensive uranium enrichment capabilities at Natanz and at the Fordo site near Qum, and who knows where else. They're building a heavy water production facility and a heavy water reactor at Arak that the IAEA has estimated will both be in operation next year. The latest IAEA report is out this week, may have new information on that time schedule. The Iranians are not rushing because they don't feel under pressure. They want the broadest, deepest possible infrastructure they can get. Now, to be sure, they also want relief from the sanctions. Who wouldn't? Who wants to go on under any kind of economic pressure if you can get it off? So I think what we're going to see, and it may start as soon as next month, if Rouhani comes to the opening of the United Nations General Assembly in New York, where Barack Obama and European leaders will be, and where there's always the opportunity. I went through this every year I've been in the government up in New York. There's always the opportunity for the chance encounter between an American leader and some other leader who wants the chance encounter at the Secretary General's lunch, waiting for one event or another to transpire, where Rouhani and Obama can exchange a few words or just the handshake that probably both of them want, and that then gives the impetus to the Europeans who are already prepared to negotiate and make concessions. And I'll tell you what the Iranian line of argument will be. As you know, our nuclear program is entirely peaceful. We have been completely transparent, and we continue to pledge transparency with the International Atomic Energy Agency. We are prepared to negotiate with the West about this program. And we're prepared to negotiate on an equitable basis. But we think that the pressure that you have put us on is illegitimate, and you're harming the lives of average Iraqis in ways that are unacceptable. The West, and the Europeans in particular, but I think the Obama administration as well, will respond to that sort of line from Rouhani by saying, we're prepared to negotiate, but concessions have to be equal on both stages. Purely, on both sides, purely though as a matter of sequencing. It's just sequencing. We will have a slight reduction in the sanctions applicable to Iran. And of course, we expect a good faith concession by Iran. And then we'll consider other sequenced reductions of the sanctions. Whenever you hear diplomats talk about sequencing, you know that they're talking about surrender. So the Iranians will say, absolutely. You show us the good faith of a slight reduction in sanctions, we'll allow you and the IAEA full access to the Parchin facility, where they were working on the triggering mechanism for nuclear weapons. Of course, they have paved over every bit of Parchin that has anything to do with the nuclear program, probably having excavated thousands of cubic yards of dirt as they have in other locations. And this little dance will go on because I tell you, for those who believe, and I do not, but for those who believe the sanctions could be effective in stopping the Iranian nuclear weapons program, once those sanctions begin to be dialed back even a little bit, once they're reduced, it's going to be almost impossible to torque them back up again. And I think Rouhani knows that, and I think that's what he's aiming for, and he may well get it. Now let me just spend a minute, as Michael did, on Syria, because obviously the relationship that he described accurately about how Iran and the fate of Iran and Syria tied together has particular import for the nuclear weapons program. The best argument that the advocates of military force against Syria because of the use of chemical weapons, the best argument that they can make to me has nothing to do with assisting the opposition, which I think is a mistake. The best argument is that the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime is such a moral obscenity, as Secretary of State Kerry said, that it requires a response by the United States, so that other proliferators like Iran understand that they can't use weapons of mass destruction with impunity. That's the best argument. And as a theoretical matter, it's an argument that has a lot of appeal. But that's not what we're going to do here. I don't know exactly, obviously, what the program will be, but all of the indications from this porous administration's decision-making process is that we will get some version of what our military derisively calls tank plinking, that we will launch some number of cruise missiles that will destroy some number of empty buildings, since the Syrians will have evacuated them. It will go on for a couple or 3 days, and we will then declare victory. And people will say, see, we used military force. It showed them that they pay a price when they use weapons of mass destruction, and that will prove to Iran that they have to get off their course towards nuclear weapons. I think this is already, you can see, entirely false. The only way you establish deterrence in this circumstance is by an absolutely punishing retribution for the use of chemical weapons, if that's what your view is. That's clearly not what we're going to do. Even Senator McCain, who is a great advocate of using substantial military force, doesn't think that's going to happen. So that the conclusion that looks likely that Assad will draw is that he's still in office, he's still in power. Hurt somewhat, perhaps, yes, but he has survived, and in his mind, survival is victory. So that he can still continue to use chemical weapons. He won't be able to use them at no cost because of the attack, but he will be able to use them at minimal cost, an acceptable cost. And I think the conclusion that Rouhani and the regime in Tehran will draw is exactly the same. It's going to be basically, is that all there is? That's it for killing 1,000 people with chemical weapons? And so they will say to themselves that at least from the perspective of the United States, they're simply going to continue with their nuclear weapons program. We will not have established deterrence. We will not have demonstrated that the use of weapons of mass destruction gets a response. We really don't know for sure, of course, but we do hear British Prime Minister David Cameron saying that the West response will be proportionate. So what does that mean exactly? I don't believe we should respond. I don't think this is an American interest to use force here, but if we were going to respond, why respond proportionately? Why not respond disproportionately? If it's a moral obscenity to use these chemical weapons, what are you going to kill, 1,000 Syrian troops? Or 1,000 civilian supporters of the Assad regime? Is that a proportionate response? In any event, I think Rouhani will see this, if it plays out that way, as an act of weakness by the Obama administration. I think it will confirm in his mind that Obama sees the negotiations with Iran over the nuclear weapons program essentially the same as the Europeans do, and I think that will inform his negotiating strategy to continue with the nuclear weapons program, not to talk about it the way Ahmadinejad did, but to keep it in the background, to gain relief from sanctions, strengthen the regime in Tehran, and continue to achieve their objectives. That, I think, is something that he is uniquely capable of doing, and I'm sure he's looking forward to it, unfortunately. Thank you very much.